Okay, hi. Clay Laban here, Membership Secretary. Thank you for Bill Ham to be our latest renewal. And we certainly appreciate any members. It's going into the, I don't think we have a room sound. Do we have room sound for? Can't. Okay. Yes, my voice will project. I just really just one thing to I included, and as some of you who were here last month, it's getting to be fall, hooray, and we are looking forward to having some new volunteers for our leadership group so that we have a full complement of officers. We really appreciate Bill for being our president this past year. We need a vice president. We'd love to have someone step up and be vice president. We have Patrick St. Cyr for programs, but we'd certainly appreciate anybody who knows of guest speakers helping him out, maybe being on the committee. We probably need a show coordinator, someone who would be interested in getting our library show set up or meeting at the where did we meet at the Williamson County Annex. We did that one time. So that gives everybody a chance to print their favorite photos and then show them to the public, and you can put a price on them if you want to. We have a February 2024 library show, Pflugerville Library Show scheduled, so you can start thinking about that. It'll be an open theme, and we probably will allow each person to do 3 to 5 images, print images for that. And there'll be more coming on that. But the nominations are open now for people that would like to be for any of the offices, president on down to any of the program committees. And there was a form. I included that in the email, but the URL has been changed. Ed's updated that form. I'll be sending out a new URL that you can just fill in the form and tell us what you'd like to be doing for the club. Thanks.
I think I've got audio. Yeah, nice and booming. Might back me off just a hair, Ed. All right, tonight we're going to talk about macro photography and what it is and prepare for November competition, because November competition is a macro competition. What we're saying competition is close-up photography. You can use any lens you've got for close-up photography. If you don't have a macro lens, borrow one. You're bound to have at least one buddy that has a lens. The subject is open. You can choose your favorite subject. You can, boy, this is not an ideal environment. The whole idea is get close to a subject. Choose anything you can get: abstract, flowers, mechanical, nature, critters, anything really. The theme is small, but there's a lot of possibility here. Something I've added to clarify this some is, of course, now I can't see the cursor on the screen. The subject should be small. You should get close to it with your lens. The whole purpose is to work with close-up, and you want to shoot close enough that you minimize the crop. The image should not be appear to be heavily processed. It doesn't matter what you do if we don't notice it. So have your way with your image. And when displayed on the screen, it should appear larger than life size. Everything I test and nothing works. So preliminaries here. There's a lot of discussion that goes along in what macro means. So I'm saying the word photograph is defined as light painting by the Greeks, using the Greek definition of the words. Macro is large or long. So macro photography is large photography, large light painting. Micro is the Greek word for small, and micro photography is photographing small things. And this is in the realm of something very small that's not easily seen with the unaided eye. 20-to-1 magnifications and greater is kind of where the community thinks it is. That's what I was looking for. Working vocabulary here. Okay, generally accepted definitions. A macro lens is a one-to-one lens. Any of the vendors are going to tell you that and stick with that as their line. The subject, for it to be a macro lens, the subject has to appear on the camera sensor at 1-to-1. So if you're shooting a 24-millimeter tall object, it should be full height on your sensor. Micro photography I just covered is greater than 20-to-1. The real point here is to do good close-up photography, macro photography. You don't have to have a 1-to-1 on your sensor. You can be very close and show the subject greater than life size. And you don't have to have a macro lens if you don't have to be 1-to-1. Try this one more time. It will be tied here. Everything I tested 2 hours ago doesn't work. Yeah. Here's some examples of macro lenses.
Then the control will be kind of powerful instead of. I mean, that's the problem factor.
Okay. So here's some examples of lenses, and we're just going to have to go through this with Zoom again, standalone. So these are all lenses that I own. So there's examples of most of them in the PowerPoint. And if you have a macro lens, this is kind of something you're looking at. Next frame. Here are the alternatives to macro lenses, extension tubes. If you added one of these to your inventory of tools, it'd probably be the extension tubes. There's optical versions that could do this for you, but you're always going to suffer from one more piece of glass in the light path. Bellows used to be a really nice option to use. Now they are completely defeat anything automatic in your camera, or are more expensive than the macro lens itself. The adapter in the middle, the automatic with the cable, is $1,200. Go ahead, next one here. So let's just slowly step through and look at some macro images. We've seen, if you were here early, you've seen all of these pass by, but just go ahead and step through those. So this is a sunflower pod before it opened in bright sun. This is the gear cluster off a bike in close, and it does not look good there. This is a bearded dragon shot in a light tent. This is a trillium that was photographed in the Great Smokies on a trip. Go ahead. An orchid shot with D300 and the 180 Tamron lens. And here's just pure art created with a flashlight and a macro lens. Next. Many of you have seen this picture before. It's a picture I've shown and it's done real well, called Threads. So it's a 1-inch bolt photographed up close. Next. No, it's not a hummingbird. Sorry, bird photographers, I don't have any bird pictures. This is a moth, a hummingbug moth. It kind of got me started into restarted in macro photography. Next. This is a praying mantis shot with a ring light strobe. So it was very close. So what makes a good macro photograph? It's an image of a small subject presented larger than life size. It should allow the viewer to see the seldom seen or noticed because you're into something pretty small. Go ahead. Oh, the bottom of that slide says that not only do you have to be, in close, you're going to need to meet all the criteria for a good image if you have a good macro image. It's going to have impact. It's going to need to be technically correct. One more. We can look at the camera system split into two parts, the camera body and the lens. And we're going to first take a look at lenses and their behaviors as they affect all photography, but are just amplified when you get up close to your subject in macro photography. Go ahead. This is my 105 macro with the semi-transparent lens hood on it. So we can see some about working distances. The spec for the camera calls out this number 290 millimeters, which is from the focal plane of the camera to the subject. That's not the working distance you get to use. If you're going to keep your lens hood, you're down to 72 millimeters. And for those who are metrically impaired, divide by 25 is pretty close answer, or get your standard measuring tape that's calibrated in both styles. So go ahead to the next frame. Yes.
The semi-transparent lens hood comes with it.
It comes with Photoshop.
Oh. Okay.
Oh, we should have microphones out, and somebody snuck in beside me, so he doesn't have a microphone. But the question was, where did I get the semi-transparent lens hood? And I got it in Photoshop. So here's the image of the Queen, and the Cohen is actually just about 25 millimeters tall. So this is the full image on the sensor shown here. Go ahead. So here's the Lauer 25 millimeter lens. It's 5X. It's got a same kind of number, 224 millimeters working distance, but it's only 25 millimeters off of the subject, or 45 millimeters off of the subject. So it's very close. So if you're going to shoot at that magnification, you're going to be in tight on your subject. You may have probably getting light in there so you can see it. So this is just the portion of the Cohen that you can see with that lens. And notice there's just tremendous detail. And just as a side fact, this is shot with the lights in my garage, which are much better than any other room in the house. There's a lot of dual 4-foot LED fixtures in the ceiling. Go ahead. So here's the standard 2470 that many of us have, the f2.8 lens. It's set up here to shoot at 70 millimeters. it gives you roughly from lens hood to subject 145 millimeters, almost 6 inches of working distance. So you can get in close to your subject, but you've only got a magnification of 0.22. So go ahead to the next one. When you look at the image on your sensor, you got something pretty small. So you're just not covering that many pixels with that image. Here's the 70 to 200. It gets you a lot more working distance because it's 270 millimeters from the front of the lens hood to the subject. It has a reproduction ratio of 0.2 to 1. So here, it's almost the same size as the 2470 version. Go ahead. So here are 6 images. The duplicate in here are these two. They're 70 millimeters for the 2470 and the 70 to 200. So you can see this one's just a hair larger. And you can, in Lightroom Photoshop, zoom in on this and go ahead. Get everything up to the same size. So here's everything shown at the same size on the screen. So now we have digitally enlarged everything except the first two. If you could see closely here, there's a lot more detail, even at this, in this grid at the bottom of the Cohen versus the one down here that's almost flattened out with the longer lens and greater setback, the 2 to 1 magnification or 0.2 magnification. Go ahead. So the next thing to think about is what can you see when you look through your lens, because it affects your composition and what you can see. Now this one's going to, next one's going to be tricky. Go ahead and hit it one more time. We're going to zoom in on this. It starts out 22 dominoes wide. It's going to zoom in on the center domino to 200 millimeters. So yeah, you're getting closer and closer to that subject, but you're seeing less and less of what's around it. So this is just a creative tool that you have and just a fact of life living with the modern camera or any lens system, camera lens system. Just for reference, each of these rectangles is 1 inch. And the dominoes are about 1 inch wide. Go ahead. I set this up and worked hard at photographing it to demonstrate angle of view or field of view. The orange outside pegs are 24 millimeter. The center pegs are 200 millimeter. And there's 105, 85, and 70 shown in there. Oh, by the way, there are lots of speaker note in this PowerPoint, and I'd intended to be able to look at them. But we will make them available online so you can see the speaker notes that I've added. Go ahead. So here's the setup I had for that. The Z7, the 2470, so I could zoom this and get it all laid out and placed. So that kind of covers angle of view in your lenses and focal length. Go ahead. So we're going to move on to aperture and depth of field. And we've got another image here that's going to move. If you look right at the bottom here, there's some blue focus peaking. There's also this red focus square. And as we zoom through this, watch the blue appear and watch the focus square blink green. And as we zoom through or sweep through, oops. Run it again. Everybody will notice they are changing. Yep, it's moving. We saw the green flash. It'll eventually move focus back until we see the back robe come into focus. And the important thing about going through all of this is that macro photography is far more sensitive to this than landscape photography. You saw just what you could see the sweep, see the focus point shift through the image. Go ahead, next frame. So here is another setup with the dominoes on the cutting board. Focus point is this 5, and this is 2.8. So you can see just moving in front of it or behind it a little bit, you don't have focus. Go ahead and step. 4.5, 4 full f-stops of aperture change. We got more in focus. Go ahead and step. F9, even more in focus. Step. At F18, we've got from the front point to the virtually to the back that's in focus. So you have much more deep depth of field, but you're at F18. The camera body has a lot of the other things that we count on. There's magic in the camera body. It will do many things for you, except make you an outstanding photographer. Say again? Oh, it helps. We will always take advantage of it. Go ahead. Say again? I'm not quite that fast on it. I'd prefer not to do Zoom is what I'd actually prefer, because I know all of these tools work without interacting with Zoom. So the shutter in the camera is really about making this, exposing the sensor to light. And it does really one thing well, and that is let you stop action. So here's a shutter speed of 1/2,500. It freezes the bike. The front wheel is frozen. The only reason you know he's moving is he leaned over and he won't stay there very long if he's not moving. Next one. So here's the other extreme. Take the shutter speed down to 1/160. If your camera and bike are in sync, it's sharp, but the wheels are blurred. And if you miss it, or if the subject or the camera moves when you're shooting macro, you get something like this next slide. It's just nothing that you're really proud of, or I'm not really proud of. Go ahead. So the sensor is another home to magic in the camera. Not only is it the place you actually collect the photons to make the image, in the modern mirrorless cameras, it provides your focus capability, which is always there, which is very nice. We have very high resolution sensors now. They're higher resolution than film ever was. They're your light meter. The mechanics that support the sensor are a big part of your stabilization for image stabilization. The sensors are probably the most high-tech part of the camera, because not only are they semiconductor, they're back illuminated semiconductor and stacked in the latest camera bodies. So they're pushing, Sony is pushing sensor technology for us. Go ahead. The only thing the sensor can really do for or to us is the quality of the image if we're shooting in low ISO. If we're in low ISO, as low as your camera's natural ISO is, you have very little grain and in the green areas is where you'll see grain in these images. But if on the other hand, you shoot at maximum ISO, you can see grain all through this area. This is not nearly as bad as it used to be. Lightroom can help in that if we use the noise reduction, it really pulls the noise down. We still lack sharpness, but we've got a usable image this way. The big secret, we've kind of talked about it, is a camera is just a computer that can capture and process images for us. It, wait a couple more. It can do a lot for us, but it can't really make us a great photographer. So it's going to be up to us to use these tools to be a photographer. Go ahead. We're talking about the exposure triangle. We need to go ahead and next slide and figure out how we're going to set up the camera. In every class I've been to, regardless of level, one of the questions that's always asked is, what should my shutter speed be? What should my ISO be? Well, the answer to all of those is it depends. But if you look at a need for having depth of field in your image, you're going to need to stop down the lens to maximize depth of field. Doing that reduces light to the sensor. That's fact. Go ahead. Back one, I think. I want to go through all three bullets here. To minimize motion blur, just like we saw, high shutter speed stops everything where it is. Macro photography, this is even more important than, say, photographing that bike. Photographing that bike, if you moved 1/8 of an inch, the letters, the text written on the bike and the labels would start to blur. If you've moved 1/8 of an inch, you've moved over a very large portion of your sensor if you're shooting macro, if you're in close. So you crossed a large number of pixels, which is blur. Low noise, we just looked at the noise from the sensor. If you're shooting macro, you want to get the noise out of there so you have a sharp image, because sharpness is one of the things that's really important in a macro image. Go ahead. So you can't ignore the exposure triangle. If you don't choose a setting for the 3 parameters, one will be chosen for you. It's just a fact of life. So you can run in full manual, you can let the camera do part of the work for you, or you can let the camera make all the decisions. You're still going to have an aperture, a shutter speed, and an ISO. So the real challenge for the macro photographer is to figure out how to configure those parameters to convey a creative intent. And it's quite often that if you're shooting with just available light, you're not going to be able to configure the exposure triangle to get proper exposure. Thank you, Clay. To get proper exposure, you're going to have to add on to that. Go ahead. So camera stabilization, the tripod is really the first thing that we go to. But there's some ways to minimize blur and stabilize it. So there's dynamic stabilization in the camera, both in some lenses and in some camera bodies. And at least in the Nikon Z series, those work together to give you really improved stabilization up to 4.5 f-stops in the macro lens. The other thing that we can do to stabilize the camera system, prevent motion, is to use a cable release or use a timer in the camera to release the shutter. Everything that I'm showing tonight, or at least in the PowerPoint, was shot with a 2-second delay from the shutter release. Go ahead.
And we'll have an app now that you can fire it from. If you want to do that.
Well, I'm old school. I use cable releases and timers.
Most people have a smart.
So physical stabilization of the camera, there's a plethora of tripods and other mounting devices. There's tall tripods, short tripods, polypods, platypods, flat ones, quadrupods, GoPros, gorilla pods. Some of the gorilla pods come with heads on them. they are the least effective that I've tried. Go ahead. So here's a couple of tripods, one that I have and one that I wish I had. You'll find that if you're working tabletop macro, that adjustable center rod or column is invaluable because it lets you frame your picture without going back to adjust your tripod. Your tripod plus or minus an inch doesn't really count in landscape, but it makes a complete difference in your image when you're shooting macro. Sandbags, bean bags, a rock, I've used them all. They all work. Ball heads and geared heads are what attach your camera to the tripods or the pods. Go ahead. There are two kinds available. There are really good ball heads that are nice and smooth and work wonderfully for most photography. The geared head is the head to have if you're shooting small subjects up close. You have just that much more control over it. Do I have a price on that? No, I didn't write a price down. They're an order of $200-300, which is actually less than that RRS ball head. Go ahead. Light is the other thing that you can do for your images, controlling the light. In general, I think about adding light, but sometimes removing light is more beneficial. Go ahead to the next frame. So I've shot a whole series of images kind of to demonstrate this. And this is the backyard with the setup that I did in full sun. And it was brutal. I ended up kind of blowing well, images move around just because it was so hot and I got hurried. So I have a scrim here. I have a speed light with a small softbox on it, camera with trigger, and a geared head and a adjustable center column. Most landscape photographers will tell you, you don't want a center column. But when you're shooting like this, the center column is a very useful tool. By the way, one more thing on tripods. Don't pay the stupid tax and buy an inexpensive tripod. Buy the better tripods. If you want to save money on your tripod, buy an aluminum one instead of a carbon fiber one, but buy a good solid one. The little tripod I'm using with center column is the first tripod I bought. The other thing on tripods is always buy tripods and ball heads with Arca Swiss plates on them. It's the universal plate. Multiple vendors have Arca Swiss. Manfrotto has some that aren't compatible, and you're locked in. So here's the first image of my copper mushrooms that I found in my junk box. But notice that in the full sun, that shadow is extremely harsh. I apologize, but this is going to turn into a little bit of the lighting class. Go ahead to the next one. So I put the scrim that you saw in that first picture over the subject. It flattened out the light. There's no harsh shadows, but it's a flat image. You can't really tell what's going on. You know, it just lacks there. No, by the way, all these images are shot essentially with the same aperture on the camera. Because the lighting keeps changing on purpose, the shutter speed changes. But that's the only thing. Aperture and ISO are held constant. Go ahead to the next one. Full sun with scrim, okay. I put the cover for the scrim over it, blocked off all the sun. And now it's still dark on the sides, there are no harsh shadows, but you start to see direction of light as the light comes in from the side and illuminates it. There's more stuff over on this side, so it doesn't get the illumination. So you get a direction of light. Go ahead. here I use the strobe as a fill. And once you start using the strobe, your shutter speed comes into play because the shutter speed controls the ambient light. What does it say in this one is for shutter speed?
160th.
1/60th. So this scrim is blocking the light. There's lots of ambient light coming in, but the strobe is coming in and filling. So here, the shutter speed has changed to 1/200th, which is the highest the Z9 will shoot. And now we have good light coming from the little softbox, and we have really suppressed the illumination of the sun with the shutter speed. Tell me if I'm lying about numbers here. Going back into the garage with all of the LED lights in the ceiling. So here's just room light. Think of it as an overcast day. It's not real bright, but it's everywhere. So here we have uniform illumination. We're casting a shadow. It's a nice picture, but we could do better. Go ahead. So in my camera bag, when we're out to shoot, there's always a little LED panel and also that scrim that you saw, that small scrim. So here, just add some light from the side. Get a directional light. Go ahead and get control of the appearance of the light on the subject so it's not uniform flat light. The next thing you can do is, go ahead. Oh, this is the LED panel alone. I forgot the sequence. So I turn out the garage lights. I can get to dark real quickly. Bad. Notice there's some harshness in the edges around the mushrooms. So here's another option that's usually in my camera bag, either a headlight or a flashlight. Here's a little flashlight. I can use that to illuminate the subject just as easily as I can any other light source. If you buy a flashlight for photography, check the CRI, the color render index. You want 195 or better so that you don't have color mismatches in your images. Go ahead. So here is that same flash unit used by itself.
Room light and flashlight.
Okay. Oh, okay, room light and flashlight. So you can see the hotspot caused by the flashlight. If I was turning this into an image more than demonstration, I'd probably want to pull it up here since this is where I think the focus is. Go ahead. Just the flashlight, so you see everything go dark. This would be shooting at dusk or later. I don't know anybody in here that goes out after dark for photography, sitting on the back row. Go ahead. Guilty? So here you can see the little softbox and strobe up here again, their speed light. The little soft boxes are $13, $14. They're nothing. And right now, I think Godox probably has a lock on lights for macro shooting. So we can see how with a slow shutter, softbox, we can illuminate the whole subject and cancel out the existing light. Go ahead. So here's a faster shutter and even more shut down on the existing light. Another technical camera thing or light physics. There's an inverse square law that says if you move the light, it changes a square of the distance that you moved it. So if you move it back if you're 6 inches away and you move it back 6 inches more, you've taken a full stop of power out of that light. And the same thing if you move it forward. So in macro photography, that is really amplified. If you're shooting a group, you can move your light back. You don't get as much power out of it, but you get more uniformity because it's spread over a big area. Go ahead. Oh, just the speed light. So again, you see just the illuminated area without the fill of the other lights. And I think my focus point drifts around. If I ever put enough effort into that to reshoot it, I'll try to mark a focal point so you can track it. The other thing that I have and don't have a lot of cycles on that yet, because I gave up my ring light that was just for the Nikon body and couldn't work with other light sources. This, if you can see it here, is the Godox MF12 microstrobes. So they fit on the front of the camera. They get the light right on your subject, so they're really close, and that gives them a lot of power as far as overdriving the normal light. This is both of them firing at equal power, so it's pretty well flat illuminated. You'd probably want to choose your lighting pattern based on or control by changing the power on the strobes. Of course, with the remote trigger, that's easy to do. And if you were a little bigger and you wanted a fill light from your speed light, you could add that in. Go ahead. Oh, this is just the strobe, so you can see just how little area they're lighting. Go ahead. So kind of let's step through what I hope I've expressed to you. Go ahead. And this is just a limitation, and you can think of it as a step through flow chart to try to resolve your stuff. If you want to get depth of field in your focus close, you need to use smaller apertures. If you use smaller aperture, you're going to be reducing your light. If your subject is close to the camera, and we talked about very tiny motions covering large number of pixels, you need a faster shutter or a strobe to stop the motion. The small aperture reduces the light on the sensor, so use high ISO. Well, high ISO is a pretty good answer until it starts to negatively affect your image quality with noise. Fast shutter also reduces the light to the sensor. High ISO. High ISO increases noise. Lower the ISO. You got to do something to break out of this loop. So change the light on the subject. Add more, take off some if you want to see motion blur. If you have a little bee that you'd like to see the wings move, slow down. You can add light from any of the sources that we've looked at. You can modify the light with a scrim or completely blocking it. I've used human beings as blocks to put the subject in the shade. So, all of your tools for light management from the studio to the movie set still work here. Their effects are amplified because you are so close and so tight in on your subject. So your creative options here are to use your limited depth of field or your limited light area to focus a viewer's eye on your subject. Use the slower shutter speed to show motion if you have a subject you want to see the motion in. Otherwise, you need to use the strobe and the shutter speed. I've said it all before, I think, but going through here, let's see, where are we back one? Yeah. Let's go forward. So use the suggestion for equipment. First of all, use the equipment you've got. If you've got a lens, it will probably focus closer than you think it will. So use it, get up close, see where you can focus. The first piece of equipment I'd add is a tripod. If you don't have a good tripod, that's probably the number one thing beyond camera equipment that you ought to be investing in. If you are limited on what you want to spend, get a good solid aluminum tripod. The 5-in-1 reflector, the little one that literally hangs on the back of my backpack and Evelyn's backpack anytime we're in the field. That is many uses. It's your scrim, it's your block. You can use it to reflect light into the subject to add light. Probably the next one would be LED panel. The little one I always carry with me because it just vanishes in the camera bag. A flashlight with a CRI of 95, so you don't distort the color in your image, is a good choice. Go ahead. Okay. So the next thing you add to your bag, it depends. What are you wanting to do? How much are you going to spend in it? Good directions are a lens or extension tubes. I think the other options for getting macro are really not viable unless you have a camera that doesn't have interchangeable lenses. Then the optical corrections are worthwhile. Speed light with a remote trigger. You can use that everywhere you go as a light, as a strobe source. The macro flashes or the ring lights are great, but they're restricted to macro photography. So what should we be doing now? Get out and learn your gear at close distances. Take whatever lens you have, find out how close it'll focus. If you shoot Nikon, you can look at the bottom side of the lens right at the camera body, and it will tell you both in meters and feet how close it'll focus. It'll say working distance, and that's the distance from your sensor to the subject, not from the front of the lens to the subject. See how long you can go handheld. With a lot of the stabilization, you can go down to 1/60th of a second pretty easily. Try long exposures on the tripod. I know Stephen and Jim have lots of hands-on on long exposure at night. But the tripod matters because if it moves, you get blur. Shoot some personal exercises. Do the depth of field exercises I did. You can pipe the video off of your sensor out through HDMI, see your sensor and everything move when you're sitting there cranking focus or zooming the lens. Play with the light sources. Make mistakes, learn from them. Let's get out and shoot. I'm ready, I'm talking. I actually got through 97 slides in just about an hour. I apologize for the lack of understanding of the equipment. So I'd like to open this up for questions and take anybody's question. Go ahead, Clay.
So,
Microphone, please. Microphone.
Question is, when you're looking for a lens, is it, what does a M or macro lens specifically differ from your zoom lens?
The specific
And why do you
lenses,
pay more?
when you look at a lens that is labeled as macro, your vendors in general will sell you a 1-to-1 lens. So the lens can focus so that the subject on the sensor is the same size as the actual subject. So subject to sensor are matched in size. there are probably, in my mind, a couple of classes of macro lenses. That Lauer lens was only about $350. It's variable magnification, 2.5 to 5. But there is nothing, absolutely nothing automated in it. It doesn't connect to the camera body. It doesn't even tell the camera body that it exists. So you focus it manually, you set the aperture on it manually. And at least our new camera bodies give you a way to focus, in that the focusing and the light meter capability in the sensor and camera body are still there for you to use. There are also third-party manufacturers that are, or second party, that are less expensive than a branded lens. Though the branded lenses are designed to work with that camera. So if you're shooting a Nikon 105 macro on a Nikon body, the image stabilization in the body works with the image stabilization in the lens. And that's where you get the most capability for stabilization. And that lets you shoot slower shutter speeds, which lets you shoot greater in less light, or with your lens stopped down so you have depth of field. Extension tubes do essentially the same thing as a macro lens. Now, the Sigma and Tamron, Canon, Nikon, Sony, the big name lenses are coupled into the camera and will focus to infinity. So a 105 macro is a 105 lens. It's a great portrait lens, but it'll focus to 101 so you can shoot macro. If you put extension tubes behind your 70 to 200, you can get in much closer, but you've given up at that. As soon as you put that tube in there, the ability to focus at distance. I used to shoot bellows all the time. Great, you can do nice work with it, but you've given up any automation. Go ahead, Jim. Do you have a microphone?
Focus stacking?
Next class. I have done some focus stacking. It is one of those places where magic hides. It's also one of those places where tedium hides. You really get into issues with stabilization. Some people shoot handheld macro, stacked images. You need to be high-speed release. You need to have strobes. You need to have image stabilization, but it can be done. And you can use Helicon Focus or Photoshop to do your stacking. If you have a small stack, for instance, 5 or 6 frames for landscape, you can stack those in Photoshop. When you get crazy shooting bugs at 40:1 magnifications, you're going to have all kinds of issues in your stacking, and you're going to need to use Helicon Focus or one of the other stack focus tools that just is far more capable of dealing with the images. Dennis, you're sitting there in a compute loop. Grab a microphone.
Oh, I quite a macro for one. It's very difficult. Because of the gadget subject you want to really focus on it.
Hand him the microphone. Ed threatened my life if I didn't do this. Yeah. The Tamron 180 macro that I have has autofocus in it, but it is so old that it actually has a motor that drives a mechanical coupling to focus it. That's a manual lens now. It's been a manual lens almost from the day I got it. The D3 couldn't drive it fast enough to track that hummingbug moth. So that became a case of manual focus, guess where the bug's going to be, set it in high speed release and get a few good images. Ty, you're close to a microphone.
I don't have any questions about this in particular, but I'm excited about doing the project. When I went on the photo shoot this weekend, I only have the tubes. I'm gonna maybe convince my wife to get me a macro lens at Christmas. But, so I'm really jumping into this macro stuff. I find it very interesting. So it's all gonna be birds and bugs. Two extremes.
You're asking for a macro lens for Christmas? Can we take out life insurance policies? Can we take out life insurance policies?
Look at your specs on your lenses because I thought I was gonna take pictures of some water lilies, and I went out and I fought with my macro lens and it never cleared up. And Bill said, you know, your focal length on your which one, 70 to 200, will do what you want it to do. And I went, crap. I can stand back here. I can stand back here and
The point you make here is to do good close-up photography of flowers. Unless you're shooting the center of the flower and looking for pollen grains, you're not going to be at 1-to-1 magnification. You're going to be in there very close, but not 1-to-1.
Yeah, like the Tamron 70 to 200 G2 lenses had a minimum focus distance of something like 0.6 meters. So you could go at 200 millimeters and something 1.5 feet away. It would be pretty close.
We got any questions on Zoom? Any more questions? Stephen, you got your subject picked out? Nose print. Folks, thank you very much. I apologize for the Zoom problems. I just did not anticipate the issue with it. I think it's the first time I've tried to do a significant presentation other than show a screen for a moment in Zoom. Thank you. Oh, by the way, just one more reminder. November image competition is the macro competition. The description of the theme has been or will be updated to include the last 3 bullets I showed up front. That's really just a caution to get in close. Don't crop to get there. In the post-processing, there was a nice image of a butterfly on, I think, a lantana blossom. But it was a little snippet out of this frame. That's not close-up photography. That's finding an interesting subject in a scene. Ed, if we drop the call, no. Any other questions? Clay, anything else? Somebody hand Clay a mic. Carol, you set silently and paying attention.
Just thanks for the presentation. It was really good. And, you know, I love my macro lens. I shoot Canon, but I have a 105, and I use it for, I shoot a lot of stuff that's out of focus. And a lot of people are very surprised when I say I use a 105 macro for that, because I think I'm using some sort of like 24, you know, 2.8 or whatever. And it's actually, it's just, I use a macro lens and just turn the focus to get it out of focus. And I get a beautiful bokeh from my macro lens, because I found that it gives me better bokeh than a lot of the other lenses I've tried. So if I want to do that out of focus look, the macro lens, I get close and then I just pull the focus out deliberately, and I get that beautiful, you know, out of focus look. And it's another thing you can experiment with. I mean, no, everybody likes the cool, like the shots of the motorcycle and everything where everything's sharp, right? But you can also just make it totally blurry and go the other way. So you really can have a lot of fun with it.
I have a Sony 100, yeah, which is an odd lens, but the bokeh is wonderful, and it's built to do that, to give you that bokeh.
It's beautiful bokeh. I mean, it's just creamy, gorgeous bokeh.
We've got somebody remote here on Zoom. I heard him speak. Go ahead on Zoom.
I love my macro lens. I also love photography and illustration, which lenses work when I'm doing something. I got a 156 camera and it's 1.5. And I also have buddies, but it's getting to put my confidence in all of this stuff. So, thinking somebody that is going to be macro, but it is going to be good, but can't do it. So it's very interesting. Exactly.
One other comment about macro lenses. Not only are they designed to focus from very close to infinity, there are also a lot of effort put in the macro lenses to be sure that they're flat from edge to edge, and they have minimum distortion out on the edges, which is not a primary driver for other lenses. Nikon recommends the new 105, the Z-mount 105, as a portrait lens also. So it is your fixed focus 105 at 2.8. I apologize, I am a dyed-in-the-wool Nikon shooter. I've had a f2 since the 70s, and Ed introduced me to the digital cameras, the DSLRs, and I've gone through most of the family of bodies in Nikon. I started with the D3, the D4. After the D4, the 850s came around. I shot an 850. It wasn't fast enough. I had a D500 for a while, which is a crop sensor camera. And when the Z9 came around, I couldn't resist that. Had to have the Z9. My wife is making tacky.
And the no fire actually, which, you know, when I first saw this started using it, the old video was shocking to me. It is nice, changes in size. Have you ever tried that before?
I have switched bodies, but I've never, the 300, the D300 and the D500 are both crop sensor cameras. But I've never used my full frame cameras in their cropped mode. It's just something I don't think about doing.
So when you use a crop sensor, of course, you get the 1.5 multiplier on your focal length, so it becomes a one.
One-to-one, now it's mega magnification, right?
But the other side of that is that you're doing a 1.5 multiplier on your aperture also, right? So it'll change the depth of field, and there is less light hitting, a total volume of light hitting the sensor because it's smaller, right? So there's some trade-offs there. But you can do the same thing on your full frame by doing crop mode, like you said, or just by zooming in,
And
cropping the photograph
wait
digitally.
Wait until post-processing if you're going
Yeah.
to do that. The other comment is that your crop sensor has a little more depth of field in it because it's small, but it also suffers from blur because the pixels are smaller, and the motion across them will create, a small motion in your subject will create blur in your image. The other thing is watch, if you're shooting benchtop, watch the air in the room. It will move your subject. You won't pay attention to it until you see the blur after you've captured the image, or maybe going in and spending time examining the image.
That's kind of a question I had. Like, I noticed when you were. That is kind of a question I had about, I noticed when you were shooting the coin, when you had that one shot where you were really and you only got the detail, when you shoot macro, it seems like it's a whole nother world.
Oh, yes.
And so your head has to be in a way in a different place, right? Because you're seeing such a detail, like it's like you're zoned in and it's so small, the focus that, how do you go from, or do you have trouble, or I guess any tips or pointers on going from like that little world to then doing a landscape and then going back? It seems it's very jarring, but it's also really fun to get into that little world of just where everything is, like those mushrooms you were shooting, it's a different.
Years ago, when I actually was allowed to touch electronics in the computer industry, we spent a lot of time under a 10-power microscope working on boards. And you kind of get used to it. It's both worlds. I don't know whether you noticed some of the images in the slideshow that was playing. One of those just looked like a bunch of balls. That's the bottom side of a chip. It's a ball grid array. So there's things that you get accustomed to seeing when you work in that environment. Now, if you want to see a transistor, it takes a scanning electron microscope, and you might be able to visualize it.
It's just a great way to get abstract too.
Right.
Because you get tight and then you just blow everything up into, I'll repeat what I said for the folks, I guess, on the Zoom. It's a great way to get abstract if you like abstract images, because you can get in tight and you lose like that sense of scale or that sense of definition, and you just can play with the patterns and the shapes because the size is so constrained and changed. It just makes it's really a great way to get abstract images, which again you wouldn't think, because a lot of people when they hear macro
this is a nice example.
Patterns, texture, it's really
There's little square or rectangular
Yeah.
pillars down in that lantana bloom with little spikes all over them. And it's one of those things that when the lantana blooms again this fall, I'm going back out there, I'm going to get some blossoms, I'm going to bring them in, I'm going to put them on that bench that I shoot with, which, by the way, I probably ought to put together a list of equipment that I use, because that has turned out to be the most convenient place I have ever shot macro. And there's a couple of things going on. That's a piece of tile from Floor and Decor. They'll sell single tiles. That's actually the one I used was a piece of granite tile. Two 1x4s screwed together to make both sides. So now I've got a lip standing up on both sides. They're good and stable because of the weight of the tile. And I can use small magic arms to mount anything I want to along that path. And for macro photography, that foot-wide path and those mounts are more than adequate.
Yeah, I use, there's a woman up in Dallas that created something called replica surfaces. I don't know if you've seen those. It's a little stand you can buy. It's about, the whole system is about $100, but it's a stand on wheels. So you can roll it around, and it's got, you can buy different surfaces that are backgrounds and foregrounds and things. And it's just like you're describing, that it's got a channel on the side, and you can snap in, and then you can put in your lights and everything. It's really fascinating. It's sort of the high end, but I also like the DIY, either way works.
Pieces of wood I've collected. I've got a friend for a wedding, cut down some fence and sanded it just a little bit. That's another one of my favorite subjects. White tiles and black tiles are really nice bases. I found that if you shoot down just a little bit, you really don't need that background. Now, when you go to do a flower arrangement or something like that, yeah, having a background that's done. I don't know whether you noticed in some of my images, I put up big scrims, the black side, but I got so close that I could see all the texture in them. And that's not what you want.
They sell also tile board. It's called tile board.
Okay.
And that's reflective and shiny. I'm sorry. They sell something called tile board in Home Depot or Lowe's. It's shiny. It's like tile, but it's shiny. It's used to like put the tiles on.
Okay.
And it's very cheap. I think it's like $10 for a tile board, and you can buy one. It's similar, and it's actually, if you're using white tile, it would be like shiny and reflective. So if you wanted to do something where it was like a mirror, you could use that, and it works really well with macro photography also, because if you want something shiny, and it comes in white and black, so you can get a shiny black or a shiny white if you didn't want to do. It's something you could go get, like a white tile, a black tile, a white tile board, a black tile board, and you've got an infinite. You really can play around a lot with just for a few dollars.
There's lots of DIY options here.
It's really cool.
Okay. I don't have my email open. This is not my primary computer.
If you want to see the transistor now, I can show you. Actually, it's not a transistor now, so we'll talk about this in a minute. So this is 4 pictures. They're all the same. They're zoomed out. So in the top left, you have a transistor here. Actually, it's a couple of transistors. Over here is the same image zoomed out. If you look at the bottom left corner, you'll see it. This is the same image zoomed out. You notice this little thing over here. Same image zoomed out once again. That thing is one hair. Well, I'll get there in a minute. Pull out of my head. So one of these hairs.
Are they that long in the picture?
This picture was taken in 1999. The latest iPhone coming out tomorrow is 1/100th the size of what you're looking at in that picture.
Yeah, you're gonna have to step up.
It should focus that close.
All right, so again, the top left, the transistor, second from K5 microphone, and then showing clockwise around is zoomed out. You can see that transistor in the bottom corner. And then on the bottom left, see it zoomed out again, and the bottom right is the final zoom out, and that thing's the hair from my head.
This picture and the one before it were shot in a light tent with studio strobes. And you have to be kind of careful as you set that up to be sure that you can, here's the front of it, to be sure that you have a shadow to attach your subject to the surface. And that was set up by Dave Fitzsimmons, who does Curious Critters. And one of the things that he suggested was, if you're shooting critters, give them a piece of paper that you can afford to toss. So he uses plotter paper, a roll of plotter paper, and builds a soft back corner so you don't see the corner behind the subject. If you've seen any of these images that you have questions about, I can go back to them, certainly the ones that are in PowerPoint, and give you details on them. That's the magic one we're not talking about yet. It's light painted. That's the flower shot where I used a human being as a scrim. And this one is just doesn't show up on the monitor. But on my monitors, calibrated monitors, it's nice and sharp. Both these flowers are interesting in that they're backlit on a black background. Let's get up close and put a lot of light on the roads. That's shot with the Tamron and the D300. That's the Tamron and D300 again. Anybody recognize that? Yes. Sunflower.
I want the record to show that I identified the plant.
I've shot a few weddings for family, and that was something I learned to do. And this is a cat photograph that I'd even put in if Josh was judging. It's a photograph, it's not a pet picture. And here's that lantana. You probably can't see it, but there's little points on every bit of that. Here's that shadow I was talking about that you got to be careful to hold on to and not blow that out. My only baby picture I've ever taken. I refuse to take cute baby pictures with them all wadded up in a ball. That's for mom and baby photographers. Bottom of a chip. Standard blue-lighted picture. Probably the most interesting thing about that one is the light colors that were used. This one is light colors, and also it's a piece of fabric called core memory. This was for a competition way back, which was Moment of Impact. Any more questions? If not, let's call it a night, folks.